You know, one of the things that my family dreads doing with me is going shopping for clothing because I'm kind of slow and I'm kind of picky and I take forever and I'll go and I'll try something on about 20 times and then, spend about an hour or more there and then decide not to buy anything. Anybody else live with somebody like that? I mean, and they just hate, going shopping with me because I'm so indecisive sometimes when it goes to buying clothes. You can tell, right? I have to have them pick it out for me. No, but in our culture, there's so many options of so many things that we get to choose. Right? Isn't there? I mean, just a couple weeks ago, my second oldest, she went car shopping to get a car, and you're online just spending hours for weeks because most people now we don't go to the stores to shop first. We go and we can look on the computer and see who's got the best deals, right? And you can just look and see who's got the best prices and all that stuff. And we just spent hours just going through what kind of car she was going to get, what color car, what kind of options, and you just kind of look and look and look and wear yourself out just trying to decide. Well, today we're going to be continuing in this series we kicked off last week called A Vision Beyond Walls. As we as a church have taken on this huge building project, I thought it would be pertinent that we study the book of Nehemiah together because the book of Nehemiah is all about just this huge, impossible building project that Nehemiah takes on. And as I mentioned last week, it's really just a picture of the gospel of Christ, the walls of Jerusalem under King Nebuchadnezzar. This is before Nehemiah's time, destroyed the walls. He had the temple destroyed, the walls destroyed, and it was nothing but piles of rubble. And the reason I say it's a picture of the gospel is because it's really just kind of a picture of our lives. And God comes to restore that which is broken and restore it back to the condition that He wants it restored to for His glory and for His purposes. And so last week we just kicked the series off just looking at chapter 1 where Nehemiah hears this news. His brother and some companions show up. There's been a remnant, just kind of give you a little bit of background. There's been a remnant that's been sent back under King Artaxerxes. All right, and he sent them back and under Darius sent them back to rebuild the temple. All right, so there's like 50,000 Jews that have gone back to Judah and Jerusalem to start rebuilding the temple. And then, several generations, and then Nehemiah's brother shows up, and Hanani, we looked at last week, and some companions, and he goes, Nehemiah's like, hey, what's the condition? What's our homeland look like? And it's just like, it's in rubble. There's no economic system. This is just impossible. There's nothing we can do, and our people are just totally disillusioned and disgraced and just broken before God. And then so God puts this incredible burden on Nehemiah's heart, as we learned last week. And all of chapter 1 is just this prayer that he goes before God and just prays that God would just move and do the impossible. So today we're going to pick up in chapter 2, and today we're going to be looking at what I'm calling just, what is it you want? Right? And because we get to just ask these questions throughout life. You're going shopping. Okay, what is it you want? All right, you're going to look shopping for a car. What kind of car do you want? For clothes, what kind of clothes do you want? What is it you want? If God were to stand before us today and ask us this question, what is it you want? How would you respond? And I think it's good for us to always be challenged with these kind of questions throughout the course of our life, especially as Christ followers, in that all that God has called us to. And we're going to see that Nehemiah, he's just going about his ordinary business. And if you weren't here last week, just kind of give you just other input background. Nehemiah is a cupbearer to the king. All right, and his job is to drink the wine and eat foods in case they're poisoned, because everybody's out to kill the king, right? And so there's always some plot, some conspiracy theory that's going on. And so Nehemiah, his job is to protect the king at all costs. And so we're picking up in chapter 2. Nehemiah in chapter 1 is just praise. He goes before God and prays. And we're going to pick up here Nehemiah chapter 2, starting in verse 1. And it says, in the month of Nisan, see, they had Nissans back then. No, it's Nisan, just being silly. Yeah, I know, stupid. Okay, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when the wine was brought before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. Verse 2, so the king asked me, he says, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. And then it says, I was very much afraid. Now, it's important we kind of do a little bit of background here is understand why is Nehemiah afraid? Is it because he's a scaredy cat? No, the reason why Nehemiah is afraid is because you don't go before the king with your own issues. Your job is to protect the king and his issues, all right? His kingdom and the things of his kingdom. It's not your place. If you remember, any of you that have ever read, the story of Esther, that King Vashti, she was ousted because she treated the king with disrespect. You don't treat the king with disrespect. If you go before the king with your own issues, it is immediate death. You would be sentenced to death. And so Nehemiah is very much afraid because he's putting himself at risk here. Now, Nehemiah was used to taking risks, As I mentioned last week, he was the cupbearer. So this could be his last drink, right? Because it could have poison in it. But he's got to drink that wine before he gives it to the king. Or he's got to eat that food. He's got to sample things before he goes to the king to make sure he gets sick, or he dies and not the king. So he was used to taking risks. But this was just a death sentence to go before the king and having a countenance of being sad. And so he is very much afraid as he's before the king. Now remember, all of chapter 1 was he's been praying. He goes before God. He's like, God, would you restore us? Would you move? Would you do this? And so now he's taking this big step. And so I want to say, when it comes to just answering this question before God, what is it you want? As we're going to see here, as it's going to come out in this story. The first thing we can learn from Nehemiah, I think what God wants us to do is be a people, is to be willing to take big risks for God. If we're to be nudged today and be challenged for the things that God has for us, is that we need to be willing to take big risks for God. So going back to I mentioned Queen Esther. All right, now if you remember, if you read through the story of Esther in the Bible, it's a book in the Bible. So this is all this is like the generation before Nehemiah. Okay, so I'm going to try to connect the dots here a little bit. As I was reading some commentaries this week, we don't have any really concrete proof that I've read. It's just kind of scholarly, educated guess on just understanding. The king who's in power right now is Artaxerxes II. The king who married Queen Esther was Artaxerxes I. All right, so if you remember the whole story of Esther, that when God's people, the Jews, were being threatened by Haman, this wicked guy who wanted to destroy them. And so, the king, he gets rid of Vashti, and he's looking for a queen. And, there's this beautiful Jewish girl named Esther. And Mordecai, her cousin who adopted her, she was a lot younger than Mordecai, says, look, maybe God's put you here for a reason, for a time such as this. And you need to go before the king, and you need to take a risk to save our people. And she does. And she risks her life. And she goes to summon the king without being summoned herself. And she puts on this great spread. She does this multiple days. And then the king says, what is it you want? And then she tells him this whole plot. And God uses her to rescue her people. So it's believed that Queen Esther, Artaxerxes II is not Queen Esther's son. It was probably Vashti's son, all right? But it was her stepson. And so he was probably alive during this time and is experiencing God's working through the queen to influence the king, and just how God's gracious move was there upon them, and how God protected his father and kept him alive because of this woman's willingness to risk her life in a respectful way before the king. And some scholars believe that she probably had influence on having Nehemiah chosen to be the cupbearer of the king, as a man of integrity, a godly man, to be at his side. And the king probably granted it because he trusted the Queen Esther, and her wisdom and her willingness to take risks. All right? And so we see this throughout God's word, that he puts us in places where we are on purpose. And so in the place that God has placed us, we just have to come to this place. How willing are you to take big risks for God? I was reading, I love the Message paraphrase version of Luke 19:26. This is kind of one of the Gospels. It's a parable of the minas, or some call it, the Gospels, the parable of the talents. God gives us all these things. And, and Jesus says, look, you have this, what are you going to do? Go and invest this. He tells this story. And this is how Eugene Peterson puts it in the Message in Luke 19:26. He says, risk your life and get more than you ever dreamed of. Play it safe and end up holding the bag. Now, how many of you in this room would say you're a big risk taker? I mean, you're just willing to risk big. How many are big risk takers? All right, there's a couple of you. Okay, how many of you just you like to play it safe? All right. And I'm just be honest with you. Now let me just ask you a different way. How many of you in your heart of hearts want to be a risk taker? I mean, you want to risk it big for God. How many of your heart of hearts want to risk it big for God? I was thinking about this past week, all right? When we look in the scriptures, we see these stories of these great men of God, just looking back at Noah, all right? I mean, God goes to Noah, he says, hey, I want you to build this huge animal cruise ship. And build it out here in the middle of the plains, far away from water. I mean, that's foolish, taking on this huge building project. And there's going to be people, coming up to him. It's like, no, you're foolish. That's the most ridiculous. You know how many resources you're wasting on this thing? And it's never going to float. I mean, there's no water around. What are you doing? And he spent over 50 years building this thing. He probably had to hire people to come and help build it. And just time, day after day, year after year, this huge, animal cruise ship, it's bigger than this entire building. This huge vessel, all right? Sitting out in the middle of the plains, it's like, that's the most foolish thing to ever take on. Why would you do that? Look at all the resources. There was some beautiful woods there. You ripped all that out so you could just build this big thing. It's not going to go anywhere. And then one day, what happened? The floods came. Right? All these animals showed up and the floods came. Huge risk that he took for God. But some could look at that and say, that's such a foolish story, because then after 40 days and 40 nights, that cruise ship is out there on the water and then it lands on top of a mountain and you leave it there. Come on, keep the thing. Go on vacation once in a while, right? I mean, it's like, that's a huge waste of resources. But Noah risked it big for God. And he saved his family. And it was kind of a restart that God did. We look at a guy named Abraham. God says, look, Abraham, I want you to leave your family behind. And I want you to go to this land that I'm calling you to. And as they're on the process of getting there, they're getting to the land. There's already people occupying the land of Canaan. And then there's a family feud that breaks out, right? Because his nephew Lot that went with him, there was just too many of them, and his herdsmen are arguing with his herdsmen. It's just like typical family, right? They're arguing and spatting, and it's like, okay, Abraham says, okay, here's the deal. God called us here. You take the best part of the land. Whoa. Abraham, no. God called you here, not Lot. You take the best. No, you take the best part of the land, and I'll take the leftovers, because I'm trusting God. And so we know that where Lot ended up, in Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? The plains of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then that whole mess takes place. But Abraham risked it big for God. We fast forward, we get a guy named Moses. Moses comes on the scene. And God sends him back to rescue his people, and they're all just kind of laughing at him. It's like, you're crazy, man. This isn't ever going to happen. We're slaves. We're going to be stuck here forever. And then all these plagues come. It's like, oh, that's great. And it's like, let's get out of here. And Pharaoh lets them go. And as they're leaving, they get trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army just stampeding down on them. And then what did everybody start to do? They start grumbling, complaining. We would have been better off back in Egypt as slaves. And now we're trapped and we're going to be killed between the Red Sea by Pharaoh's army. And what did God do? He parted the waters. He did the impossible and rescued his people. Guys like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had their Jewish names changed to Babylonian names. And the king, and Nebuchadnezzar, he builds this huge statue of gold. And he says, everybody under my power, you all bow down and worship this gold image. But these three guys, somewhere deep in our heart of hearts, we want to be like them, right? They didn't bow down. They said, I know what the word of God says, and I am not going to bow down and worship anything but the Lord my God. And it's like, look, if you three don't bow down right now, you're going in this fiery furnace that he created. He's like, turn it up. And the guys that are turning it up are being burned to death. It's like, turn it up, And those guys still, no way, I am not bowing down to anything but the Lord my God. Now I think somewhere deep inside of us, we all want to be one of those guys, right? And they're thrown into the fiery furnace, and what? The Son of Man, one who says like the Son of Man is there. The scholars believe is the pre-incarnate Christ is there rescuing them, and they didn't burn up. They're in the flames and they're not burning up, and God rescues them. We fast forward to a guy named Daniel who was thrown into the lion's den and survived. And then we get to the New Testament, we got a guy named Peter. And I love Peter. Because Peter's a guy that's just always impetuous, always saying something he shouldn't say, always doing something he shouldn't do, always putting his foot in his mouth, right? Over and over again. But I think deep inside of every one of us, we want to take big risks for God like Peter did. And I think of the scenario when Jesus sends the disciples ahead. He says, you guys go on ahead, and I'll catch up with you. And he sends them out in the boat. And they're out on the Sea of Galilee, and this storm kicks up, and they're out there. And then all of a sudden, this ghostly figure's walking out on the water, right? And they're all freaking out. Oh, it's a ghost. It's a ghost. Boo, right? They're freaking out, right? They're scared to death, And then Jesus says, whoa, time out, guys. It's just me. All right, let's look at this. This is in the Gospel of Matthew 14. It says, Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Verse 28. This is Peter's response. He says, Lord, if it is you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Now, I don't know about you, but that's where I want to live my life. I want to live my life on the edge, but I'm going to be honest. I tend to want to play it safe, all right? I tend to want to play it safe. It's safe here. And the other guys, the other 11 are like, Peter, shut your mouth. Stay in the boat. I know you can swim, but there's a storm and the boat's rocking. Just zip it, buddy. And then he's like, come, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And Peter's waiting for the very words that I think we all wait for throughout our life. What does Jesus say? The next verse, he says, come. Right? And don't we all want to kind of live on that edge and say, okay, God, I want to trust you. Just speak the word. Just say it. Just tell me to come, and I'll get out of the boat, and I'll walk on the water. And he says, come, he said. And then Peter got down out of the boat, and he walked on the water and came towards Jesus. But the other 11 stayed in the boat. And I don't know about you, but I tend to play it safe. I'm just being honest. I do. I tend to play it safe, but I want to live on the edge for my Lord and my Savior who risked everything for me. And my prayer is, God, just speak the word. Just say come, and I'll do it. But it's like, I'm on the other 11. It's like, dude, just zip it. It's like I'm going to stay in the boat where it's safe. I know that it's my Lord and Savior, but I don't really know that I really trust him. Right? Isn't that really what it comes down to? I don't really know. I want to trust you. I believe everything that's in this word, but God, help me to be like Peter. Even if I miss it, help me to be that risk taker for you and for the things of your kingdom. And so as your pastor, as we're taking on this huge building project, trust me, I don't want to spiritualize this. I don't want to try to justify and rationalize it before you, but I just want to share my heart with you. And I feel like it's my role as we're taking this on to walk us through, because the book of Nehemiah is just a great study, I think, for all of us, even for me, to be reminded of some of the challenges that goes on. And Nehemiah, he risks his life before the king. It could have been a death sentence for him. And so I just kind of walk us through. There's three aspects we're going to look at as we go through the book of Nehemiah that he comes across. Is it kind of goes across with any project that we take on for the things of God and his kingdom. All right, so I just want to take a few moments and just kind of look at three aspects of the project. And I'm kind of intertwining between what Nehemiah is taking on and what we're taking on as a church and just as a people individually, as we live out our lives and how we live out our lives before God. And so the first key aspect of any project is just the physical resources to do the work. And we're going to see how this comes together here in Nehemiah chapter 2. We have to look at what are the physical resources needed to do the work. I mean, Jesus says, you don't build a house until you count the costs, right? And so as a church, as our leadership team, we've sat down, we've kind of looked over everything. And as you heard in the meeting we had a couple of weeks ago, we just started to begin in this year. We just started pretending. How many of them were kids? We like pretending, right? So we started pretending that we were paying a mortgage. And we set aside money starting back in January. That was kind of one of our goals. Let's just pretend that we're taking on a mortgage. And let's just start putting money aside. And it's just incredible how those numbers are so close to the numbers that we ended up with and our mortgage payment for this building. And so we've sat down, we've counted the costs, we've looked at the material resources, you got to look at people resources. Is this a safe one to do? Are we going to stay in the boat or are we going to get out of the boat? We want to be wise in the whole process. The whole book of Proverbs talks about wisdom. And so there's the physical resources to do the work. And then the second one is just the wisdom needed for taking on the work. We need wisdom. I mean, we're all working jobs and trying to take on a building. There's a lot going on. So we got all these contractors in there looking at stuff, some of our own contractors. We had inspections, and there's all kinds of stuff, just doing our due diligence to kind of nitpick every little thing and see all the things that are wrong with the building, but yet all the things that are right with the building. And then at the end of the day, when we're looking at the financial resources and we're looking at just the wisdom that we're getting together of all this information, then we just got to shake all this stuff down and make a good decision, a calculated risk decision, right? So we could know how to move forward in this whole thing. And this is what Nehemiah has to go through because there's no economic system back in Jerusalem. And as we go through the book of Nehemiah, you see it's just a mess. And for Nehemiah, it's like, I have no idea how this is going to happen. This is going to take a big move of God to pull this one off. Because the walls were just destroyed. They were in rubble. All right? And there wasn't an economic system. Where are we going to get the resources to rebuild this wall? Where are we going to get the people to do this? How's this even going to take place? And as we go through Nehemiah, we're going to see how that all comes together. All right? So Nehemiah is looking at these same things. But then the third piece that I just want to kind of tie into this, and not to spiritualize it, but it's a part of how God has wired us in relationship with him. And the third aspect is just the spiritual leading from God. What is God saying in the midst of it all? And so as we've just been walking through this process, Nehemiah, we learned all of chapter 1. He goes, he fasts, he prays. He's got this deep burden for the things of God in his kingdom. And he's going before God and he's praying, God, speak. God, give me grace, give me wisdom, help your people. And so this is kind of this huge process. What is God saying? So we go on to verse 3. Let's go back to Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 3. So Nehemiah, he goes before the king. He says, but I said to the king, he said, may the king live forever. Dude, you're the best. High five. I mean, you're amazing. There's no other king ever like you. I mean, this guy's like really buttering up the king because he knows this is a death sentence. He says, may the king live forever. And why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Verse 4, and the king said to me, what is it you want? You know, and I was wrestling through that this week as I was just reading this and praying about it. I said, you know what, that's a really good question. It's really kind of my second point. Number 2 is just, what is it you want? And as I said at the beginning, I think that's something we all just need to really wrestle with throughout our life. What is it? If God puts us in a place, and he's throwing this question out there in your life, and what your life is all about, what is it that you want? And if you're standing before the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he's asking that question, I think it's important that we know how to answer it. And really what he's asking is like, you know, in a spiritual sense, what are you asking God for? What are you believing God for? As I said, I'm one of those guys that likes to play it safe, and I get ridiculed sometimes. You know, Roger will sometimes ridicule me because I'm Mr. Tightwad, Mr. Frugal, you know, and he's like, yeah, we like your little makeshift kids check-in sign, but could we just buy one? You know, there may be, $100, you know, but, you know, and so, I mean, it's always a balance, you know. It's not that we just go spend or whatever, but I'm Mr. Frugal, play it safe, let's stay in the boat. But then it's like God's asking this question, what is it you want? And Nehemiah's standing before the king, and he knows that he's sad, and it's like carrying his burden before the king. It's a death sentence. And then the king asks the question, what is it you want? And now what are you going to do? When God asks you the question, what are you going to do? And it goes on. It says this. You better do what Nehemiah did. The rest of that verse says, then I prayed to the God of heaven. Yeah, you better pray quick when you're in front of the king. And so he says, I prayed. You know, he's probably praying under his breath. He's praying to the God of heaven. Oh, God, please, 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 please. All right, we've all been in those situations. Taking that final exam you didn't study for. Oh, God, please, 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 please. I wanted to study. Really, God, I did. Right? He prays to the God of heaven. Which brings me just to the third thing that we can learn from Nehemiah is before you take a big risk from God, you wrestle it over with God in prayer. You wrestle it over with God in prayer. And I just want you guys to hear my heart in this because I'm telling you, I have wrestled this thing over and over and over in prayer. And I've asked people from our church to be praying. I've asked you guys to be praying. And I got people that text me every week saying, how can I pray for you this week? What do you need prayer for? And as a leadership team, we've just been praying, and I've just been praying, and I've been journaling. And some of you see me walk in the neighborhoods, right? People say, yes, I'm out walking in the neighborhoods. I'm like, God, are we foolish or what? Is this crazy? Why will we build a cruise ship in the middle of the plains, And I'm just out praying, and I'm asking God to speak and confirm as I'm going through my one-year Bible. I wish I had time to tell you. It was like all the times when God's words just lined up with all the decisions that had to be made. And even the day we signed the purchase agreement, that morning I sent to these guys, I said, man, I'm reading this morning in my one-year Bible, the 4 gatekeepers that were responsible for, I don't even know the exact way it says it, but there's 4 gatekeepers that were responsible for the temple and its furnishings. And I thought, man, that's my reading for today. And the 4 guys on our board that are responsible for making this huge decision. And it's like, God, I just feel like you're confirming and confirming over and over again. And so I just want to take a moment to share a little bit of my story, because we've been pursuing this whole thing of church planting for like 20 years. Back in 1998, Cindy and I, we moved our family up here. We were 8 months pregnant with our youngest daughter, Hannah. You don't move when your wife's 8 months pregnant. Let me just tell you, don't ever do it. It's crazy. But we felt like that's what God was calling us to do. And so we moved from Bloomington, Indiana up here. We started going to church planting conferences prior to that. And then we just felt like God said, look, I want you to move up here. And we moved up here. I was still working in Bloomington. I'm driving back and forth until I took a job on the north side at a company up in Carmel on 116th Street called Telemon. And they hired me on as an audiovisual engineer. We designed and installed AV systems in federal and government courtrooms around the country. And so it's this really nice corporate job that I'm now in up on 116th Street. Now, what's amazing about the whole thing, how God orchestrated it, was the CEO and owner of this company was a Chinese guy by the name of Albert Chen. He was a Chinese Christian. His brother used to be the pastor of the Chinese Community Church up in Carmel. And he didn't know until we started having conversations that I was a Christ follower and that I was planning on going to ministry at some point in time. We moved up here for the purposes of church planting. But he hires me on, and Albert Chen, he's just this little guy. He's just this gracious guy, and I probably had maybe less than 10 times had conversation with him for a period of 3 months that I worked there. But prior to taking that job, earlier that year, this is in 98, I had a dream that I was sitting in a restaurant with a dark-haired business owner, and I was telling him the kind of church that I would want to plant, what it would be like. That it would be a church where just our people would just be passionately pursuing God, loving God with everything we got. And we'd be a people that would just go and change the world with the good news of Christ. And I just remember I'm in this dream, I'm just sharing this with him. And this dark-haired business owner, he had a blue jacket on, and he reached in his pocket and he pulled out his checkbook and he wrote a check for like 112, I can't remember, 118. It was a little over $100,000 and said, here, go plant your church. And I remember waking up that morning, and I immediately grabbed my journal, and I would encourage you, if you don't journal, to keep a spiritual journal. And I just grabbed my journal, and I wrote it down. I said, God, if this is from you, I just pray that you would confirm it and bring it about, and that you would send me to meet that guy. And I wrote that in my journal, and I wrote a prayer down, and I prayed. I said, God, make that connection. And it was like 9 months later, because that was like the beginning of the year, I go on, it was like this time of year, I went on staff at Telemon Corp. And find out that this guy, now here's the other thing. I studied Chinese, Nehemiah. I studied 2 years of Chinese in college in Chinese studies. And so it really came in handy because there was one time he hired some minorities that were Chinese working there. They didn't know any English and they couldn't figure out how to wire something. I'm like, And how I remembered one word, one noun. You remember nouns when you're studying a language, and they all had these notebooks with wiring diagrams in it. And I turned to this guy, and he's like, I was like, Nita Benzitz Einar. It's like, where's your notebook? And he goes, oh, yeah. And he goes and opens up his notebook, and I show him how to wire it. I was like, phew, thank you, God, for 2 years of Chinese. Never used it since, but it was fun. So this guy, so then I was asked to go on staff at another local church here in town, the Vineyard Community Church. I was asked to go on staff full time. I was only there at Telemon for 3 months. I didn't even finish my probation period. And so the day before my last day, the CEO and owner, Albert Chen, comes to me and he says, Jim, I want to take you out for lunch. It's like, okay. So this is a corporate, Fortune 500 company, so he takes me out. We go to this Chinese restaurant right up there in Carmel. And we sit down, and here's this dark-haired business owner sitting across the table with at lunch. And he says, we're talking about the division. He says, Jim, you don't realize this, but this division is going to shut down after you're gone. I'm like, no, don't say that. He said, no, it probably will. I'm like, come on. So, and it did. It wasn't my fault. But anyway, it's a whole other story. But so then he says, but that's not why I'm talking with you. The reason I'm talking with you is because I just want you to know this. God puts people in mine and my wife's life throughout the course of our life that he's highlighted, and you are one of those people he's highlighted. I was taking seminary classes at the time, and he said, I want to pay for your seminary classes. And he said, if there's anything you need financially, you just let me know. Now, I'm kind of a little bit of a feeler inside of me. And so I just remember leaving that day, and I'm driving back around 465 to, the Greenwood area in my little beater 89 Honda, and I'm just bawling all the way home. I'm like, God, I don't deserve this. I'm a nobody. I'm just a wretch most of the time. And this guy's offering to pay for classes and whatever I need. And so as I'm driving home, I'm remembering that journal entry. And so I went home, and I'm going through boxes trying to find that journal that I kept earlier, and I opened it up, and I went and I found that section. I was like, God, you are so good. And I took it back with me the next day, my last day, and I went in, to the king's office, Albert Chin's office. I said, hey, Albert, do you have a few moments that I can just share something with you? And he's like, sure. I said, I just want you to know how God has ordained for us to meet. And I opened up my journal and I read it, but I did not mention anything about the finances. I didn't mention a number. I just, read kind of around that part and shared it with him. And he knew that we were pursuing church planting. Second floor, he looks out the side window. He says, Jim, he says, I have 8 acres out here. If you want these 8 acres, you just let me know. They're yours to build a church on. I don't know why I'm in Greenwood right now. I really don't, but I just remember going home that day, and I just felt like God spoke to me and said, look, if I'm calling you to do something, I can put anybody that I want in your path along the course of the way to provide for what I'm calling you to. You stay faithful to what I'm calling you to, and let me do the rest. It wasn't even long after that when we built the house we live in now. The framer, I ran into him one day when I was there at the house just checking on how progress was going. This guy was an elder at his church. He owned the framing company. He took me out for lunch. And he goes, so what are you doing? I said, well, we're on staff here. We're eventually looking at baby church planting. He said, guys, dude, our church, we kind of been struggling right now, but we need some help. But we've got 5 acres over here in Heartland. It's like the largest subdivision in Indiana. He said, I can talk to our board. We can give it to you if you want it. I'm like, what? And so once again, I felt like just God's just been confirming over and over again. So we were in this process of church planting almost 4 years ago, September 13th. It was like in May, we started praying, started setting aside, and we started going. We're just fasting and praying, asking God. And we're going around having people that we knew that just did a lot of ministry prayer and had prophetic gifting to speak. And one of those places was over the Eastview Vineyard, where Norm Hykins, who's sitting here in this room, was on their prayer team. And they're praying for us. And as they're praying over us, we didn't even tell them what we were doing. And he says, hey, I'm just kind of coming to mind here is this whole story of Albert Chin. I'm like, I have not told that story for years. That's over 10 years ago. And he's remembering this story. And we just felt like this whole conversation, what God was bringing up was confirming. It's like, I have a meeting with him next week. I actually went and met with him. I never took a penny from him, believe it or not. But he was in a very discouraging place. And God sent me to go back and connect with Albert and encourage him, minister to him. But God confirmed that for us, saying, look, I'm calling you to do this, to plant this church. And I'm just sharing all this because of this. Let me just kind of put this next bullet point up here. When we're taking big risks for God and trusting him, God can put anyone at any time in our path to provide and accomplish what he is doing. If we're just willing to take big risks for him. And when he goes before us and he asks us, what is it that you want? It's like, God, I want to see marriages in central Indiana changed, impacted for your kingdom and for your glory. I want to see families restored and impacted for you, for your glory. I want to be a part of an army of people who just passionately pursue you, who are sold out and willing to get out of the boat and take risks for you and for your kingdom and for your glory. And so whether or not it's the right step or not, all I can say is we've prayed and we're just trusting God. We just feel like God has led us to this place. He opened all the doors, which just brings me to this last point here. Number 4 is to be ready for God to open all the doors. Because the moment that it was like this 20-year period of time that Cindy and I have been praying and pursuing the heart of God. It's like, when God finally says, now is the time, we need to be ready to open all the doors. And Nehemiah, he's standing before the king, and the king says, what is it that you want? Seriously, this can really happen? And so it goes on here in verse 5, and Nehemiah is like, would you just send me back to my homeland? And he goes on in verse 5, it says, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. And I say, you don't go before a king of one nation and ask him to build your kingdom of another nation that could be a threat to his kingdom, right? But he's got this incredible burden, and he's been a trusted advisor, he's been a trusted cupbearer, and he goes before the king, and he says, well, if it pleases the king, would you send me back to my homeland that I can rebuild it? Verse 6, then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, so how long will your journey take? And when will you get back? And it pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Now what's taken place here is that God opened the door. And Nehemiah had been praying and praying and praying. He knew the condition of what things were down, but he hasn't even been there yet. He's just walking by faith. He's not even been back. We even got to the place where he goes to Jerusalem. He's living by faith, and God opens the door as he risks his life and goes before the king. Verse 7, he says, I also said to him, just one more thing. If it pleases the king, I got this open door. I better be ready here, right? I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so he will give me the timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. Now, guys, I know it's easy for us to read the text, but that is just a miracle in the making for a king of a nation that could easily be threatened by the Jews. They've got a history of wiping out other nations in their past. And for this Persian king to grant his request to go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and to set up shop there is a huge risk. And yet God, the gracious hand of his God was upon him, and he granted him his requests. The last verse here we're going to look at today, verse 9. So I went to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and a cavalry with me. Sent a whole army with him, that he be protected the whole way to take on this huge project that God gave him a burden for. And so I just want to challenge us as a church that I think we need to just to pray and ask God, what is it that you want? What is it that we're after? And that we would live our lives as we looked at last week just with a burden for the things of God and his kingdom. When God says, what is it you want? If you're going to pray about this, what is it you want? That we're ready, we're poised, we're ready for the doors to open for God to then do and provide what only God can do and provide. Amen. And so I just share this with us because I just really trust and believe that through this process, I'm not the smartest guy. I'm really not. I just depend on just a team of some of the most skilled people and gracious people that's in our church and others that we've just got in to look at stuff. And we're just trusting God in this whole process. And it's a huge risk. It is. Every house we bought, it was a huge risk. As I shared with you last week, the first house we bought, the walls leaked, right? Our basement flooded. And the cost of repairing it was much greater than what we had. So I went to the book and got a book for dummies on how to fix a basement. And I did it myself. But I just want us to be a people that just trust and walk with God. And I want you guys to be able to ask questions along the course of the way. Don't hesitate to ask questions. Because as we're going to go through Nehemiah, we'll see we've got to be together on this. We've got to be a unified front. And we got to walk and trust God. And the title is a vision beyond walls. It's not about this building. This building can come, this building can go. It's about God's kingdom and his purposes, that we would never lose sight of them and continually stay focused on changing the lives. Who is in your midst? Who has God put you around in the workplace? That one mom who's contemplating having an abortion or leaving her husband. Are you willing to have a hard conversation with him and take a risk for God and the things of his kingdom? Those kids who are just broken and need someone to love on them. A conversation with a family member, a loved one, a neighbor. That we would just live continually with a vision in front of us for what God has called us to, which is so much bigger than ourselves. Amen.